Now, when most of us think about a breach of contract for a buyer, we think the worst case scenario is they're going to lose their earnest money. But that's not necessarily true. It could be a whole lot worse. I've got a story to tell you with a case that I'm handling that you need to be aware of so that you can guide your buyers correctly in case they need to get out of the contract. What's really at stake if the buyer decides they want to breach the contract? Now, most people are going to think, well, the worst case scenario is they're going to lose their earnest money, but that's not true. That's actually not as bad as it gets. So what does the Oklahoma Real Estate Commission standard form say about the buyer being in breach of contract? Well, of course, one of the things that it says is that they could lose the money that they've paid up front, up to 5% of the amount of the purchase price. And that's basically our earnest money, right? But that's not the only thing the contract says about what could happen if the buyer's in breach of the contract. The second thing the contract says if the buyer's in breach says that you could pursue specific performance as a seller. Now, it's unlikely to happen in most cases for a court to award specific performance to a seller, but it could happen. And specific performance is basically just saying, hey, we're going to force you to close. You're in breach of the contract, but that seller, they could force you to go ahead and buy the property. Now, the third thing is the area where most people don't realize what could potentially be at stake. And I'm handling a case for a client that will be instructive to tell you exactly how bad it could get. So let's talk about this story. Now, I've changed the amounts in the scenario a little bit, but this is going to illustrate what actually could happen. So say you have a contract where your buyer has come in and they've decided we're going to buy this property for $400,000. Well, on down the road, they end up breaching the contract and say they want to get out. And maybe you've told them, well, listen, if you try to get out of the contract, the worst case scenario is you're going to lose your earnest money. And let's say, hypothetically, they paid $1,000 of earnest money. So they're thinking, well, if I get out of this contract and I breach, that's okay. It's $1,000. It's a lot of money, but not the worst case scenario. I'm going to go ahead and do it. Now, what happens after that? Say the seller goes, puts the property back on the market, and the best they could do is $380,000. We have seen in the last few years rapidly changing markets, so who knows what could happen, and say that's the best they could do. Now they go to court, they sue your buyer who breached the contract, and they say, listen, not only did they breach the contract, but because of that, they've cost us actual damages of $20,000 because we had a contract for $400,000. We've mitigated our damages. We put it back on the market, and the most we could get for it was $380,000. So we've lost $20,000, and the buyer, your client, is responsible for that. Could the seller actually get that money? And the answer is yes. I'm handling a case with almost this exact same set of facts, and the reality is that there is case law on the books in Oklahoma that says, with the exact language we have in the contract now, not only can the seller pursue the earnest money, but they could pursue actual damages. And in this case, once you've mitigated your damages, you've done the best you can. In this case, there's a $20,000 loss under this scenario, right? So therefore, the buyer could be responsible for not just their earnest money loss, but the actual damages of $20,000. That's a major deal, right? That's a completely different scenario. And a lot of people don't realize that the contract is written in such a way where that could be the outcome. So here's what I want you to do. Be careful about talking to your buyer. Make sure they understand that if they're in breach of the contract and they decide they want to get out for some reason, it's not just their earnest money that could be at stake. That may be the case, but it's theoretically not everything that could be at stake. They could be responsible for the actual damages, which could be a significantly higher amount of money. And I don't want that for you. I don't want that for your client, because if you've told them, listen, no worries, it's just going to be your earnest money, and it gets a whole lot worse than that, I don't want you to be on the hook for that. So make sure you're guiding your buyers correctly. Let them know that if they're going to breach the contract, maybe it's their earnest money. It could also possibly be specific performance. They could force them to go ahead and buy. And it could also potentially be the actual damages if for some reason they can't recoup that on a second transaction. So be very careful about that when guiding your buyers. There's a whole lot at stake if there's a breach of contract. And I hope this helps fill you in so you can guide those buyers. and make sure that they know the real consequences that could happen in the event of a breach of contract.